The Cleveland Browns shocked the NFL world when they selected two quarterbacks in this year's NFL draft. So, on today's episode, we got to talk about the Cleveland Browns draft on how it went from promising to having some serious questions. Y'all know I'm going to talk about it and break it down, but you got to hear the music first.
Welcome to your number one spot for all NFL news and content, NFL Central.
What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back into another episode of NFL Central, your number one spot for everything NFL. I'm your host here, Bobby, and I'm holding it down on today's episode. So if you tuned in with me, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. But hey, the Cleveland Browns, they had a really good start at least in my personal opinion, on how they was going about their draft early on. You see early on in the draft, they traded out of the number 2 slot, and then they allowed the Jacksonville Jaguars to select Travis Hunter. Not necessarily mad at what the return was for the Cleveland Browns. They kicked their draft off by first selected in the first round Mason Graham, defensive lineman out of Michigan. Really good selection there. Then in the second round, with the first pick, the 33rd pick in the second round, they selected Carson Schlesinger, linebacker out of UCLA. And then just a few picks later, still in the second round, they selected Quinshon Judkins, running back out of Ohio State. And then in the third round, that's when they really started to get questionable for me when we talk about the Cleveland Browns. They first selected Harold Fanning Jr., tight end out of Bowling Green. Now, I'm not too mad at it simply because Fanning, he pretty much led FBS in receptions with 117 and receiving yards per game with a little over 1,500 yards in 2024. And it's not a bad selection for me personally, just because we have to consider that they still have David Njoku, and who was still on the team. And then they had Jordan Akins, who was pretty much a 32-year-old backup. He did still was able to go out there and produce a little bit over 300 yards for the team. So I understood that they just wanted maybe another pass catcher that they can rely on coming out of the tight end slot, because it seems like Kevin Stefanski really wants to, lean on that running game a little bit more, get back to, some of the things that helped him out earlier on when he first became the Cleveland Browns head coach. But I will throw it out there. Why not try to look at a more dynamic pass catcher or another athlete who can provide you some versatility in the Savion Williams? You know what I'm saying? At that particular mark. But again, I'm not that upset about the selection. And I will say it was still a bit questionable, but I still understood where they were going right there. But then the Cleveland Browns draft made a turn for the worse. They went out there and drafted Dillon Gabriel, a 5'10 quarterback who pretty much, if we keeping it real, it's a little questionable. I don't necessarily know what Dillon Gabriel is going to do in this NFL, but I don't think at that particular point he was the best selection to go for, especially if you wasn't taking Shedeur, who we seen falling at that particular moment in the draft. Why not go out there and try to shore up some parts of your defense? I'm talking about safety Xavier Watts coming out of Notre Dame, who in my evaluation is very good in coverage, who is a physical safety. He can come back and provide some stability in the run game if you need him to do that, but a very good prospect to help your defense shore up some things, because the Browns last season total only had 4 interceptions. They had 41 sacks this past season, and Myles Garrett accounted for 14 of those. The next best person on the Cleveland Browns to get a nice number of sacks was Zadarius Smith, and he only had 5, and that was before he was traded to the Detroit Lions. So that's why it started to turn for the worse for me when you talk about the Cleveland Browns and what their intentions were and what they were trying to do. And hence why I'm sitting here saying that it was questionable for me, because you need to shore up both sides of the football as best as you can. Now, when you talk about going out there and you getting a Dylan Gabriel, I'm not making the case that you could have taken Shedeur Sanders there if you wasn't really feeling them. But some guys that are on my list that I pretty much believe who could have helped that pass rush alongside with the Myles Garrett, alongside with the Mason Graham, is number one, Xavier Watts, like we just talked about, to help that back end. But as a pass rusher, why not go look at a Quay Walker from Alabama who has a ton of upside? I know it's going to be somebody that push back and say, hey, he wasn't really a good starter over there. But at that particular moment, a pass rusher in that moment, especially when you consider the quarterbacks you already have on the Cleveland Browns in a Joe Flacco, in a Kenny Pickett, you don't necessarily need to go after a Dylan Gabriel right now, right? At least right there, you could have went a different avenue and looked at a guy like Q Walker from Alabama who has that upside. Or why not look at Tyrion Ingram Dawkins out of Georgia, who is 6'5", 276 pounds, that could provide a lot of versatility for the Browns pass rush, who only had 41 sacks this last season, and Myles Garrett accounted for most of them, and everybody else nobody else had more than 3. So you need that pass rush to go out there and continue to build out that defense, because there are 2 sides of the ball, and we know that games are won in the trenches. So why not look at Tyrion Ingram Dawkins, who can provide versatility for the Cleveland Browns by lining up inside and outside. And that's just a higher upside pick, at least for me, that they absolutely could have went after. And I understand the will to say, hey, we're going to establish the run. We're going to make sure we give our quarterback something that they can work with. But you already took care of that problem with selecting Quinshon Judkins. And so now you go out there, you get a Dylan Sampson, who I don't think is a necessarily bad player. I think he can be really, really good in this league, but you cannot neglect the trenches. If you're the Cleveland Browns, you cannot neglect the trenches, especially what you've seen this past season, with most of your sacks coming from one player. And the second best player that got the most sacks is no longer on the team because you traded him away. So make it make sense for me. That's how it went from a promising draft to some serious questions having to be had, because then after the Dylan Sampson selection, you select another quarterback in Shedeur Sanders, who is better than Dylan Gabriel. I don't care how many times people say he's a Big Ten winning. I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear it. Shedeur Sanders is absolutely better. Every single evaluator had Shedeur Sanders being better. And if you didn't want to go out there and take a chance on him earlier, you had other options because you knew that he was falling. And if you felt like you had to suddenly snatch him up, you should have just snatched him up a little bit earlier, or where you took Dylan Gabriel, and you still could have went out there and addressed your trenches on the defensive side. Myles Garrett is the highest paid rusher in the league right now, $45 million per year. What are you going to give him to help stabilize this defense so you can finally start winning more games in Cleveland? Because the last few seasons have been underwhelming, to say the least, for the Cleveland Browns. So some of their mistakes early on, they coming right back to effect how they approached this draft. And you started off really, really well in this draft right here in 2025. And then you started to just make some questionable decisions. I'm just saying, like, and if you wanted to say, hey, we needed another running back, there's some running backs out there that you could have let go undrafted, or maybe use some capital, maybe from next year's draft, that I don't think would have required some type of huge payout to go and grab somebody in the later rounds. That's just my train of thought on it. That's why I believe that the Cleveland Browns draft went from a very, very promising one to having some serious questions. Why do you now need 4 quarterbacks, to that active quarterbacks, to be clear? Why do you need 4 active quarterbacks going into this season? Most teams only keep 2, at max 3, and the third guy's normally on the practice squad. Why are you wasting your time doing things like this? Why wouldn't you try to shore up the back end of your defense when they only were able to accumulate 4 interceptions? Just doesn't make sense to me, simply because if you want to go out there and help your defensive backs be able to take away the ball a little bit more with interceptions and stuff like that, what helps them is a good damn pass rush. That's not nothing you can argue with. Everybody knows that a good damn pass rush can help some mid to below average type of defensive backs. Now, I know this is a process that they have to constantly take bites at the apple at, but at least at this moment, Mason Graham is going to be Mason Graham. I think he's going to do absolutely well. Myles Garrett, we know Myles Garrett. He's an absolute monster. But then after those two players, what about the other side of the line? Do you still trust some of those guys that are going to be there coming into this season, the same guys that weren't able to accumulate no more than 3 sacks? The Cleveland Browns. You went from promising to some serious questions that we have to ask about what you were doing in this year's NFL draft. But that was just one of those quick videos, man, that we had to discuss. Let me know your thoughts and everything down below, ladies and gentlemen, because I think that though it's not 100% bad of a grade, I'll be honest right there, because you can't be mad at coming out with, some of these players that you came out with in the Mason Graham and the Carson Swinzinger and Quinshon Judkins and Dylan Sampson. You can't be too mad at that. But at the same time, I know you gotta address some of those needs as well. And I know most philosophies say we take a best player available regardless of what it is, but at the same time, you have to have some type of intentions behind what you're trying to do. Maybe I can be on the other side of it, but I believe I'm right on side of it that the moves after taking Harold Fanning Jr. out of Bowling Green, a lot of them, all of them, you ask me, was questionable based on who they selected and where they selected those guys at. So let me know if you agree or disagree. Let's have that conversation down below. But hey, that is it for me today, man. I appreciate y'all for tuning in to another episode of NFL Central, the #1 spot for everything NFL, man. Before you go, hit that like button and subscribe. And I appreciate y'all over here. Make sure y'all continue to love football, and I'm going to catch y'all on the next one for sure.